Mr. President, I am honored to follow the senator from Texas and have shared time with President Bush as he has, and appreciate very much his service to this Senate, to this country. You know, the hardest thing they ever ask us to do in public office is eulogize someone's funeral that you don't even know. But because you're a senator and you got a name that everybody back home knows, they think that'd be a good idea. Well, it's the hardest thing for the senator to do. The easiest thing to do is to be asked to eulogize somebody you love and know, because you don't have to look up things and read things and do a biography. But that too is also very hard, because it's hard to keep the tears back when you talk about the experiences you had with someone who's gone on to a better place. That's kind of the role I'm in today. George Herbert Walker Bush did so many things for me in my lifetime that I can't begin to count them or recount them all for you. But I'm going to tell a few of the stories because you've all heard how many times he was at the CIA, how many planes he shot down, how many times he did whatever he did at Kingport. You've heard all of it. We all know he has a resume equal to none. Nobody has one equal to him. But we also know, those of us that knew him, and I know Senator Corman did in Texas, as a public servant, he was a passionate, compassionate, get the job done, common sense, conservative leader who wanted to see not just the promises made, but the promises kept. How did I meet George Herbert Walker Bush? I'll tell you how I met him. He was Vice President of the United States of America. He was on Air Force One, because he was Vice President under Reagan, who controlled Air Force One, riding from St. Augustine, Florida, to Atlanta, Georgia, to do a fundraiser for me when I was running for governor of Georgia. I knew him by reputation and by name, and obviously being in my party, but I didn't know him as a person. He said, why don't you fly down to St. Augustine and meet me there? We'll fly to Atlanta for the fundraiser that night. Bring your family with them, let them go out on the airplane, and let's have some fun and get you elected governor of Georgia. We had a ball. That was not hard. Winning the governorship was a little bit more difficult, but it was a lot easier to try when the President of the United States came out and put his name on the line for me. And I really didn't understand how he could risk for his career doing that until I realized nobody cared who I was anyway. But he cared who I was because I was a potential candidate for governor. I was a Republican. I was somebody he had liked and admired. I was somebody he wanted to help and work for. So my family and I piled on Air Force One, flew into Atlanta Dobbins Air Force Base, went to the Waverly Hotel, raised $750,000 in a fundraiser, and it was over in the flash of an eye. But I can still smell the room, indelibly recognize the lights that were on the banners that we had and the speech that he made that night, because he was an overpoweringly impressive guy. And when he stood there and made a speech and Lee Greenwood followed him with how great it is to be American, you knew you were among royalty and a special person. He wanted me to work for him in his presidential campaign. And I said, Mr. Vice President, I'll be more than happy to do that. And I did. Now, I didn't run it. I was not the top dog by any stretch. Paul Coverdell, former United States Senator here, was his campaign manager. Fred Cooper, his financier, was the one that raised the money. They did a lot to help him get elected, but we did help him in Georgia get elected and carry it when he won that race. And in 1989, when he was sworn in, he started out on a journey as President of the United States after he had already been CIA director, after he had already been Vice President of the United States, after he had already been every other thing you could be, from congressman and head of the UN delegation to everything in between. But now he was taking on the prize job of them all, the presidency of the United States of America. I polled well as I was running for governor. In fact, halfway through his first term in 1992, was halfway through it, when they did a poll, I was doing pretty good. I wasn't winning, but I was doing pretty good, and everybody attributed it not to me, but to the fact the president came down and helped me. And he was doing real well, too. In fact, if you'll remember, George Herbert Walker Bush in that year had a 91% favorable rating at the beginning of that year. 91%. When he lost 2 years later, he was down in the high 30s. What happened? How could this guy that's so great and so gracious, so wonderful, who did everything, fall so fast? I've answered that question many times because I've wanted to try and rationalize it myself, but I watched that fall when I watched George H.W. Bush do what he thought was right, even though what he did might be wrong for him. And I want to explain that. The speech he made in New Orleans to get the nomination in 1988, he used a simple little line. He talked about shining cities on the hill. He talked about a foundation. He talked about the Lights Foundation that he started. He talked about helping others who didn't have as much as they should have, and he wanted them to have. He talked about giving a little back to your country. He made his speech equivalency to John Kennedy's Peace Corps speech or great speeches made by other American presidents. He was a caring man. He also made the speech where he said, "Read my lips, no more taxes." Now, I've never seen or heard anybody who took credit for giving him that statement, because that statement probably led to his most difficult time in his re-election campaign. But at the time he made it because George Bush knew he might have to do that. And he wasn't going to continue a race for president without saying, look, I don't want to raise your taxes, but it's something we think might happen. And it did happen, and it cost him the election. But he did what was right for the country, although it might not have been right for George H.W. Bush. But he was that kind of guy. He'd put the test on what's best for the people, what's best for the country. If you listen to or read many of the stories about the Iraq War, when we first sent troops in, George Bush was the first one to do that. I remember riding in my car home from my office in Atlanta thinking when the news broke, the president was about to do a press conference. When I turned the radio on, he was making the announcement that he was going to send troops into Iraq from Kuwait and go after Saddam Hussein and get him to give up his weapons of mass destruction. We still have troops in Iraq today. We have troops in Afghanistan today. We're fighting the ultimate war between good and evil of terrorism versus the American way and peace and prosperity. But that's a war that was engaged by George Bush, not because he liked war, but because he loved peace. Not because he wanted to fight, but because he wanted to demonstrate through strength that we can negotiate a settlement through diplomacy far easier and with less damage. George Herbert Walker Bush did everything he thought was the right thing to do for the right reasons, even if the final decision was not good for him politically. He still did it if it was right for the American people. You can ask no more of a politician. You can ask anything you want to, but you can't ask anything more of them than to do what they think is right, regardless of the consequence. I know I love Mark Twain's quote, "When you're confronted with a difficult decision, do what's right. You'll surprise a few, but you'll amaze the rest." George Bush, Herbert Walker Bush, was an amazing man, someone whose life will indelibly be in my heart and my memory. For all the things he did for me and my children and my grandchildren, and all the things he's done for you and all of us as Americans. To his son, 43, he was a great chip off the old block. He's probably as good as his dad, but nobody will ever be nicer than his dad. But George Herbert Walker Bush, George W. Bush, the entire Bush family, Barbara Bush, I send my sympathy and my support for you in this time of trial. I thank you for the sacrifice you've made for our country and for your husband and for your family. And I pledge to you, I'll try and always be as close to I can. I'll never make it, but I'll do as much as I can to be as good, or try and be as good as George H.W. Bush was. I hope when I die, and the papers report on that if there is any, they'll be as kind to me as they've been to George Bush, because what they've done with George Bush is told the truth. Not told about any failures where there might have been a few. They've talked about his victories. They've talked about his passions. They've talked about his love. And most of all, they've talked about a great country, the United States of America. It is today great and will always be because of men like George Herbert Walker Bush. May God bless his soul and thank him for the service he's brought to our great country.